in Jungian terminology, which I don't love because it implies gender binary kind of language, anima and animus. Like those two things are really in balance for me. So I have a huge capacity. In fact, I find with some people who self-care systems have put them into higher functioning modes, mobilized or higher functioning modes, that there is this like ability to choose to perform less well sometimes as part of the work, right? But yeah, I definitely resonate. I love enough time of being alone and having inwardly focused quiet time at home. Like home is like, I love my home. I love my studio. And then I also do need that like real human connection and interaction and engagement with culture. But it's always, to me, it's just about those balancing energies within any one system that regardless of gender are always needing to,
to see,
to come into balance. Like some of my clients, we talk about really practical things like money, right? Where we talk about really practical things that require action. And then some people need to practice being more instead of doing. So it just depends on the person and each of us where we're at, whatever stage in our life we're at as well. So But I actually look at if people get a bit more rooted and grounded and balance out those energy systems, that attunement and that sensitivity can really become a superpower.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Dano, and welcome to Unknowingly Connected, a podcast for people open and curious by nature with specific interests in the human potential and the greater good. Twice a month, I interview professionals who have gathered their diverse passions or gifts to be in service of human leadership. You will hear from their journey and their techniques, crafted to be within everyone's reach, and explained from a scientific, body, mind, and spiritual perspective. It's all connected, and we might not even know it. The body isn't an end point, it's a door to the psyche. That's one of the bombshell my guest, Jane Clapp, would say, and what led me the last couple of years to inquire around my learning. So, as said, today I have the pleasure to talk to Jane Clapp. And it is a very good opportunity since, beside being an excellent professional and having a very good reputation, Jane do not offer many podcast interviews those days. And she has decided not to be on social media anymore. I've invited Jane Clapp to record a conversation since I've been following her for quite some time. And I did and still do some of her workshops. I also appreciated a lot her initiative at the beginning of 2020 during the first lockdown to offer a weekly space to work on our body-mind, which led me to invite her for the Embodiment Conference in the same year, where she shared a very interesting conversation with Kristen Neff and William Lammers on leadership and sensitivity, or basically how to deal with hypersensitivity and people with big ego. In case you don't know Jane Clapp, she's been a practitioner in the holistic health industry for 2 decades. And now she's an advanced candidate with the Ontario Association of Jungian Analysts. She's a psychotherapist under supervision and an expert in the intersection of the body and psyche. Combining the two, along with creativity, she has developed what she refers to as Jungian somatics. In this episode, we talk about her background and what brought her to move from a corporate job to her actual art. How working with the body and the mind, versus only one of the two, is important. how we can be both sensitive or hypersensitive and strong, the complexity of human being, and how labeling or the ready-made solutions to help a client is quite reductive. And you'll also hear about intuition, cognitive trends, symbols, and archetypes. Enjoy.
Good morning, Jane.
Morning. How are you?
Good, thank you. So I wanted to have this conversation with you for quite some time, so that people get to know what you do and how is your approach. And I think now it's a better time because I had a practice with you with some workshops, so I know a little bit more of what your approach is. So I think it would be more specific than a generic podcast about asking you like generic question about what you do. But what was interesting is that I've listened to some of the podcasts you've done in the past, and there's few questions I have that I haven't listened the answer from previous podcasts. So let's see how it goes today.
Okay, great.
Okay?
Yeah.
So usually I start by asking where you come from and what brought you to, let's say, I'm going to say embodiment as a lot as for now, and then we'll go to more specific.
Mm-hmm.
So you were born in Vancouver, am I right?
I was born in Vancouver. I grew up mainly on Vancouver Island in Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
The beach was my playground. It's a beautiful place to grow up, definitely in so many ways. I grew up with lots of animals around, dogs and cats, and they were kind of really a big part of my life, despite being allergic to them. So I grew up in a family environment that didn't really have a lot of secure attachment or really fundamental safety, although everything on the surface looked pretty, okay. Yeah. I moved away from home when I was about 19, and I did a business degree. So I guess I would say my self-care system became really high functioning. So that has been like in a real more mobilized state. If people understand nervous system language. So I did a BCom, and then I worked for a trade union as part of kind of an internship for a couple of years as a research officer, and kind of doing quasi-legal work, putting together like grievance arbitration cases and doing research around that. And then I worked for a couple big corporations, one of them being Molson Breweries, where I forced them to implement a human rights policy for the entire brewery. Wandering through the brewery and seeing like nude pictures of women when I was in my, mid to early 20s. It was just a bit of a shock to the system. So I didn't stay there for too long, surprisingly.
Yeah.
And so my initial work was in conflict, working with conflict and often adversarial conflict. And I studied interest-based conflict resolution, which would be kind of called relational conflict resolution. Yeah, so kind of getting underneath what people are really needing versus like positional states. That isn't really all that possible in for-profit environments, I would say. But it's definitely something I've carried with me into even my clinical work now, and making space for conflict and the kind of transference, co-transference fields that can come up with clients,
Yeah.
So they have a place to have agency in relationship, which is really depth-based.
That's okay. He agrees.
Oh yeah, here y'all can see my amateur therapy dog.
Yeah.
That often crowds my client spaces on the couch over across from me, but she's quite good most of the time. But yeah,
She has something to say.
she had something to say. Yeah. So I moved out to Toronto with my partner at the time, and I realized I just couldn't be in a job where I had to hide what I was thinking and feeling. So, yeah. And I didn't really want to work in conflict all day. So I went and I returned to some fitness work that I'd done, and I trained as a personal trainer. And it was sort of just like a stopgap measure. And I also kind of dropped a lot of the persona of the business person, the young successful business person. And I moved into some more artistic work and acting and comedy. I created kind of a traumatized character, I realized, based on what would be called like European clowning, which I didn't really know I was doing until someone asked me who I trained with. And I'm like, what are you talking about? What's European clowning? So I did that for a while. It was great. And then I just sort of meandered my way into the fitness industry full time when I found this beautiful studio, which was the first kind of really progressive fitness and movement studio in Toronto. There were a lot of people in the arts, film, writers, media, and it was just this like incubator of innovation. And that was my home for about 5 years. And then I opened up my own studio. And it was a really private studio tucked away in this old factory building. And it became this space where people could come and see me individually and kind of fall apart a little bit, in a space where their bodies could really kind of feel safe. And I didn't know early on that I was really interfacing with the effects of trauma on the body. But I knew that with all the people who were coming in to see me, and there was no recipe on how to work with them, I would work with people that people were afraid to work with or thought it was out of their, their training. But I learned. I used all of those challenging situations to grow and learn and research and research and research, and then find courses that would help me help them. So I ended up working with a lot of people who were living with the current effects of trauma due to like cancer treatment or other critical illness or assault or childhood abuse. And I talked to them through their bodies, I guess, really. And resiliency was a huge part of what they needed, which is basically the first stage of trauma work is safety and stabilization. So helping people feel safer and more not in control, that definitely isn't it, but more of a sense of like accessing where their strength is in their bodies. So mindful strength was a huge component of my work and always has been, from a very like balanced perspective where you're bringing the body back into balance, into optimal biotensegrity, if anybody knows what that word means. And so, in table work, I studied a lot of energy work and fascial stretch therapy and just hands-on work and really listening in a different way and understanding the fascial system. So, yeah. And then I realized that as I was working with people somatically and welcoming people with really complex trauma, that I was constantly trying to maneuver scope of practice. Like where does my scope of practice end? Where am I like stepping over into things that I don't have the understanding, the supervision, the training, the umbrella to work within? And so I was in Jungian analysis, I still am. And I'd been considering studying psychotherapy, but it never felt like the programs I looked at, I was like, yeah, but there's a lack of kind of embodiment in that. And then I realized in working with the body the way that I did, I was working with the unconscious psyche in people, whether it's their personal or what Jung would call the collective unconscious, and the impact of that on their body, and that the body became a way for a gateway into dialoguing with the unconscious. Now, people think of the unconscious as a place of repression, like Freudian. even in trauma work, people look at it as we have to uncover these memories and bring them up and then release them. But the Jung's conversation around the unconscious, it's also a place of wisdom, where the self lives, where our inner God archetype lives, where creativity lives. So it's much more expansive than like repressed memories and trauma. And, as we all know from really relating with our bodies, it's more than a place of pain. It's where a lot of things can emerge, can be a place where a channel for communication with things that we are blocked from, that we need to access. So I started studying Jungian analysis almost 3 years ago, and I have a ways to go. But I'm an advanced candidate with the Ontario Association of Jungian Analysts, which allows me to offer Jungian analysis under supervision. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. And I've really looked at Jung's work as really holding it all. It doesn't feel like when I'm looking at somatic practices as being excluded from Jung's work. Because if we really go back to what he was studying, he originally was interested in physiology, and the impact of, how things show up somatically for people, and how somatic symptoms are kind of clues, teleological clues in terms of attempts at self-healing. So when I go back into Jung's work, the body is all there. It's all there, And the body is the home for the soul.
What I was saying is that I think now for what I see, it seems there's like nearly two school. People are like, okay, like the therapist, like traditional therapist would be okay. From here, you need to understand and blah, blah, blah. And then people are like, no, it's all in the body, the body, the body. And I think you said one day, it's like, it's the unity, right? It's like somehow it's in the body and you need to understand, and it goes together. There's no like nearly separation, I would say, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we like answers. We have a really hard time living in questions and ambiguity. And Dr. Ian McGilchrist talks a lot about this. Like we've had like kind of right brain hemisphere damage in our culture, because we're looking for systems. We're looking for linear systems for healing. We're looking for answers instead of living in questions. It's difficult for us to do that in our like kind of cultures that we live in, mainly, Western cultures or whatever. I mean, look at the shape of cities.
Oh yeah.
And so our brains feel more calm when we feel like we found answers. And so when we think it's all in the body, if I can just figure out my nervous system, everything's going to be great, right? And then it temporarily makes people feel calmer because you're not living in so much ambiguity. But the reality is, I work with people with very complex trauma, and the answer's inside of them. And my job is to help follow the clues for their particular, like, coming into wholeness and healing through their system, right? Through their psyche, through the ways that their self with a capital S is trying to guide them.
Yeah.
So it might come in through their body, but not every body talks to people in the same way. Right. And if we think of like the whole conversation around typology, well, body-based work works for people who have access to feeling and sensation, but some people are more thinking types. Like some people think more abstractly or more intuitive. So how do they get helped? How do they get supported? They have to work in different ways. So so it's great. Like, I work with people who are so frustrated because they can't do this embodiment thing. Because if they could just get embodied and like get in relationship with their body, I'm like, well, you already are, right? In addition, you know, really being in the body requires being fully incarnated, and that's not safe for a lot of people yet. They need to have distance from their body to be able to get through their day, to be able to live, to be able to function. So yeah, it's the way that we package things to be digestible. And our brains have a very difficult time living in complexity, more so now than ever, with the kind of soundbitey information that we are taking in all day.
Absolutely. And it reminds me some clients I had, you know, that for some reason they coming as if they're feeling guilty. They're like, okay, I don't really feel my body. I should feel my body. And I'm like, maybe that's not the thing you're practicing the most. And I mean, I would talk about me, but I assume you agree. It's like, I need to meet you where you're at. And maybe we need to start talking first. And then if your brain can, you know, there's also an interpersonal connection that is really important. So if you're not matching your client where they are, there's kind of, you know, like the same as the therapy, the kind of relationship between I have a problem and you're going to tell me what I have to do versus let me get know you and then maybe help you go where you need to go, which is a different relationship.
A lot of somatic training programs don't address transference and countertransference at all. And if you don't know what that is and you're a practitioner, then I have no words.
True. Well, it's that's where you need to work on yourself first. That's for sure.
But even beyond working on yourself, like, how do you track the field between you and a client? If you're going in, my job is to help this person be more connected to their body. Okay. That's an agenda. You are in control. You have a predetermined goal and you're trying to execute it. When we think of people living with trauma, I mean, that is absolutely not helpful because it's not attuning that person to their particular path of healing. And how we connect with their body and what is the end goal? Okay, so you're going to connect with your body and then what? Right? Like, I don't know. It's just sort of funny to me that I'm like, I'm going to help this person connect with their body. I work with people who've worked with somatic practitioners who said, we can't talk at all. We're not going to talk at all about the narrative because the narrative isn't important and you're leaving your body by going into your head, and going into your head means it's a defense against feeling or dealing with your feelings, right? Like this comes up and I'm like, narrative is really important because without us having a memory, it makes us some type of memory, whether it's words or maybe for some people it's implicit memory. Maybe it's, you know, different ways we deal with memory, but not having memory and negating the importance of narrative can lead to people who live with like symptoms of depersonalization, for example, to feel even less connected to their lived experience. So, and it's not, somatic practitioners aren't trained to deal with the narrative, right?
Yeah.
And so they're like, we can't talk about that. So we're going to put that over there. And we're just going to focus on your body. And then you're going to feel all these things, but not have an ability to put language to it. And I'm like, you're fucking people up.
And
you can't compartmentalize human beings like that. That's not fair.
No. And that's where I notice for people who are not from the field, I would say it's when you go to a body worker or something and it's like, okay, they've done something to me. That's how people feel. It's like, so there's not no empowerment there. It's just like, I can't do anything by myself. Therefore, I need to,
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And if people haven't studied healing power dynamics in healing professions, for example, as part of their training, it's very easy to unconsciously get caught up in an archetype when you're a practitioner, right? Savior, God archetype. I'm doing this thing with my energy, with me, with, and that can be really tricky for a client, someone coming to you, because those healing powers and those dynamics need to really be looked at consciously.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. That's I'm not coming from a Jungian background, but it's true that even, and I would talk about myself, is because I did the Enneagram, which is something a bit that have.
Yeah, no, I love the Enneagram. It's great because I love the Enneagram because it talks about the shadow side.
Absolutely.
Right,
Absolutely.
Which is, really helpful for people.
Yeah. So surprisingly, I would say I've been working a lot with coaches and therapists who have the same type as me. Go figure. and the thing I found out, and I would talk about myself, and it's recurrent for the helpers, which is type 2, and you've got a lot in the coaching and therapy field, is that you've got good intentions. You want to help. So what's wrong there? And then when I've been helping some of my peers in compassion inquiry, I've seen the fact of like, I can't be with the pain that much. I want to help, and then I feel good when I help. Therefore, I have an agenda eventually. Mm-hmm. And that can be tricky. That can be tricky for the client, and sometimes it's a little bit pushy, I have to say. That thing is something I've done in the past, that I could see what was happening, and I would push more than the body mind of my client was willing to at that time. And then I had this kind of backtrack reaction of, I don't know, something that was too much. And that was my own personality. It's like there's a lot of good in there, and there's the shadow you need to be aware of, which is like, for your own pride, you push a little bit too much your client.
Well, and for me, I track that in my body when that comes up for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is where okay, so people think if you're in talk therapy, it's not embodied. Right? No, it's deeply embodied if you bring that lens to it.
Yeah.
If as a therapist, you're really present with your own body and you're able to sense and pick up on what might be happening in the unconscious of your client through their body or through small, subtle movements, it is embodied. You can be talking and
of course
be deeply embodied and feeling into the space between you and a client. So with those urges to go into doing, maybe when it's not skillful, sometimes it is, sometimes it's not as skillful. You can track in your body those urges, right?
Absolutely.
Right? You can feel it. You can track it here. Sometimes it's what you're picking up. Sometimes like with understanding transference and countertransference, or what I've heard one supervisor call co-transference, the field you're creating together.
Yeah.
You might be feeling in your body what the client is feeling.
Yes.
Right? And that's what they're not able to be with. So you have to hold it for them. In the space without necessarily acting on it.
Yeah.
Right? Or sometimes you can name it, with curiosity. Sometimes I'll say, I'm kind of feeling this right now. I'm not sure if it's coming from me or if you're feeling that, but I'm feeling that. And it's, So
absolutely.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually I ask the open question. I'm like, what about your chest area?
Right.
Leave it open. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's me picking, or is it's just me? As say, like transferring what I feel to you, which is not. Yeah, absolutely.
And with the like ability for the client to have their own experience and not agree or not resonate with,
Yeah. I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Jane. Just a small break to let you know that I asked a couple of practitioners to say hi to Jane, and I received a video from Paul Linden after our conversation, which I'm sharing to you right now. So you will hear how Paul, which you can also find in episode 7 of Unknowingly Connected, how Paul and Jane share the same intention, although they have a different practice. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to Unknowingly Connected, and on our website with the same name, unknowinglyconnected.com. If you subscribe, you will have access to a free small video workshop with Paul Linden with really powerful tool he's sharing to us.
Hello, Jane. My name is Paul Linden, and Stephanie was nice enough to suggest that we connect, that I record a greeting to you. I looked at some of your material on your website. Very interesting. I think in some ways we dovetail. We're going in the same direction, in a totally different direction. What I mean by that is I feel that it's a meeting of a poet and an engineer. My movement home for the last 50 years has been Aikido and some other martial art practices. I also have a Feldenkrais certificate, and I've studied Alexander, done some yoga, done a lot of different things. But Aikido is my home. And where I've come from with that is a very clear, crisp, empirical way of working with movements. I like everything to be defined operationally and precisely. That way I know what the person means, I know what I mean, and I know what we work with. And that would seem to be more of an engineering approach. And I see yours as more feeling, intuitive, unplanned. I guess I could use those words about mine, but in an engineering sort of way. I think what's interesting is that we probably come to much the same place in the end, or in the beginning. The way if I were to summarize my work, the key piece for me is intentionality, the sense of projecting yourself into space toward a goal without losing what's inside, contact with what's inside of you. And where I'm going with that is a slogan that I try to express it with is, power without love is brutality. Love without power is ineffective. So I think in the end, we're probably going towards much the same thing, wholeness and teaching people how to find themselves. So we do it in that direction, and yet goes in the same way. Thank you. I'd like to know more about what you do. It'd be fun to experience it. Bye-bye.
Jane, I wanted to talk about something that I got curious is when you've been mentioning a few times your hypersensitivity.
Oh, hypersensitivity. Okay, yeah. I love it.
and what I found interesting is that I think a lot of people, and I used to have this image of hypersensitivity of someone really weak, like who can't do much. And I found it really interesting to see that you came from, and I would say, athletic background. which seems like some, I mean,
Ish. Well, I wasn't
Ish.
an athlete. Like I was never good at sports, but yeah.
I can't find the word right now, but you said that you started to do some resistance, right, with your body.
Oh, that's strength training, like
Strength training,
strength
yeah.
work. Strength and mobility is like always in my life. It never goes away.
Yeah. So, when you think about strength and resistance, for me, it looks as if it was like kind of opposite with hypersensitivity.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm just curious because, I mean, I'm sharing now because a few years ago, someone told me I might be hypersensitive because she was, and then she found out, it was like, And I rejected a little bit because I was like, no, I'm strong. I can't be hypersensitive, and that's why I wanted to have a little bit this conversation, because I've seen some of my clients having the same reaction, a little bit of like, no, I'm strong. So how can I be hypersensitive?
Well, I'm curious, if you don't mind me
Sure.
digressing a bit. What's your definition of hypersensitive?
So hypersensitive in the sense of picking up, maybe being sensitive with crowd, noise, smells. This kind of.
I wouldn't describe myself that way.
Okay.
Yeah, no. I go in, I just have to like what I'm doing. So I go out into the world quite a bit and engage in culture. I'll go to concerts, but it has to be something I really like. Like, for example, I'm going to Massey Hall is a beautiful theater that just opened up again in Toronto. And I'm going there to see Broken Social Scene. And it's a very big indie kind of experimental band. I'm going there in a couple of weeks. I'm going to see the symphony in Montreal. Like, I really love smells and I love traveling. So I wouldn't fit into that definition of hypersensitive for you. I live in the city near trains, I like the little kind of drone of the sound of the city. But I am very, I definitely pick up on energy inside myself or around me. So I would say that I have an ability to see underneath things. And my body or my unconscious speaks to me very loudly through my body. Yeah. And in doing so, it actually forces me, like I define, recently I realized what resilience means to me. And this might help for some people who identify as being more like sensitive to things that leads to an intolerance for things. Like there's some things I really can't tolerate and or choose not to be around. And in a sense, that is a strength, because to me, resilience is, and this applies to people who've made it through a lot of different types of trauma, but always seem to come back to themselves somehow.
Yeah.
Resilience is this like the strength of your soul to call you back to it. Sort of like as some people describe it as like a tensile gossamer thread that yanks you back, right? So for me, my sensitivity would be more about my soul will call me back when I get off track, or when I'm in environments that aren't good for me, or I'll get somatic symptoms that'll be like, no, like come back over here. This isn't right. And so to me, that's like the resilience behind that is, for whatever reason, regardless of the choices I make for myself or things that have happened to me in my life that have been traumatic, I get pulled back home. And so sometimes those sensitivities to things that I don't feel good being around or feel dissonant are actually kind of gifts to always pull me back home.
True. Yeah. No, it makes sense. I was thinking while you were saying that is, to me, the sensitivity. When I track people with sensitivity, I would say, or hypersensitivity, the way you would like to name it, is I usually say it's not about not going to a crowd, as you say, like to a concert or anything. It's just about measuring the energy you have and how much you're picking on things. So maybe the time you would need to go back to yourself afterwards. So not about like cutting yourself for everything because, but more about making choices and making conscious choices about, okay, now I have enough and now I need to go back to myself, or I need to resource. So it's a little bit about boundaries, about saying like, maybe not this environment, maybe not that person, or yes, but to a certain degree, but then it becomes a choice about, I choose to do it for whatever reason for a certain amount of time, and then I go back to myself instead of maybe pleasing or doing it for the sake of because everybody is doing it, or So that's what I was a bit curious about.
Yeah, no, most people who know me would call me very strong. And in fact, I'm like, I don't want to wear the superhero cape, like my friends, they know I'm very like emotionally alive and complex, but also very strong. And I would say that's like a big part of what I bring to my work with clients, is that balance between the two systems that so many different traditions have spoken about, of Eros and Logos. That like I do have a pretty strong balance of those two energies in Jungian terminology, which I don't love because it implies gender binary kind of language, anima and animus. Like those two things are really in balance for me. So I have a huge capacity. In fact, I find with some people whose self-care systems have put them into higher functioning modes, mobilized or higher functioning modes, that there is this like ability to choose to perform less well sometimes as part of the work, right? But yeah, I definitely resonate. I love enough time of being alone and having inwardly focused quiet time at home. Like home is like, I love my home. I love my studio. And then I also do need that like real human connection and interaction and engagement with culture. But it's always, to me, it's just about those balancing energies within anyone's system that, regardless of gender, are always needing to,
to see,
to come into balance. Like some of my clients, we talk about really practical things like money, right? We talk about really practical things that require action. And then some people need to practice being more instead of doing. So it just depends on the person and each of us, where we're at, whatever stage in our life we're at as well. So But I actually look at if people get a bit more rooted and grounded and balance out those energy systems, that attunement and that sensitivity can really become a superpower.
True.
If you learn how to root it and ground it and create kind of like a container around it, it can definitely become a superpower, but you have to learn how to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, definitely. I did too. I wanted to share something with you because I'm looking at the time and it's just flying.
I talk a lot.
I remember you a few years ago doing some kind of drawings, when you were, taking those big sheet of paper and letting your body draw, because of the research I'm doing and the people I know a bit here and there, it reminds me, and I'm going to tell you now how you feel about it. It seems to me that the way you were doing it was looking at like a trance.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's, I call it embodied active imagination. But even in my research now, in terms of alchemy and embodiment, I'm doing in my training program, there is this trance-like state that we can go into when we have a strong enough ego center. So, for example, in nervous system language, you can't really go into those trance-like states with a small window of tolerance, right? So you have to have to be able to drop those psychic defenses. It's in Jungian work, it's called abaissement du niveau mental. It's like the lessening of psychic restraints to be able to, but I do a lot of preparation work before I come to the drawing. So yeah, that's been a big part of my work. I do that in smaller scale with clients where we'll kind of go into some symbolic representation of what they're feeling in their body, or we'll take an aspect of a dream where there's higher affect and we'll go in and then see what comes out through the hands. So tell me more about what you were thinking of. I'm really curious.
Oh, no, it's just because I am following someone, a French woman called Corinne Sombrin, for quite some years. And to make it short, she's became a shaman in Mongolia by chance because she reacted to the music of the trance. So she became, she went into trance, and then they ask her strongly to learn from them for 8 years. And now she's bringing it for quite some years now. She's bringing the trance into our Western world. And she's teaching people how to go into a trance, auto-induced trance. And it's not like woo-woo, because they're actually doing in France kind of master degree in a really big business school around trance, and she's showing the benefit in terms of creativity, in terms of curing people from certain disease and so on. So she's highly followed by scientific, and she's done like the auto-induced trance with like all these machines around her so they can see what's going on in the brain. But I got curious because what I saw and now what I understand seems to me like a kind of trance. And for me, what I find it interesting, it's because it's a way to go to the subconscious without the need of using like substances or anything. It just can be from yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, there's other practices that do this and have for a long time, like sand play therapy. Expressive arts often, but there's this dialogue with the unconscious that can emerge when we feel safe enough to let down hypervigilance, for sure. However, with people who are more dysregulated, I would be really careful about trance states. It's really clear, even in Jungian work, about who it's not for.
Yeah.
And Jung really came across this practice of active imagination during the Red Book with what was called his confrontation with his unconscious, and him dealing with his own trauma history as an assault survivor. And so that's sort of where it emerged, and the drawings that he came to in that process. And it's sort of beyond words. Like, you have to feel it. But the thing is, it's just like with a dream to me. It's a balance. You don't want to overly intellectualize what emerges, yet it would be like going on a psychedelic journey and then not having anybody help you integrate it after. You need the stage of integration after, or else it's just a passing experience. It doesn't actually necessarily, or like with dream work, people, some people think if you have a dream, but you don't really look at it and analyze it and make meaning out of it, it still has an impact on you, like a healing capacity. I don't know. I know that when people, when I do dream work with people, and it starts, things that they didn't see start to come up through being held through someone else's eyes, because we can only see what we already know. Right. So if we do trance work or drawing, but we aren't necessarily able to see past what we already know consciously. So I would just say that work, the integration work after, or the looking at things more objectively after, is really important. And some people have these altered consciousness states, but it's never integrated. Yeah. And so it doesn't actually sort of stick to you in the way that it could.
Yeah, right. And it's funny, it reminds me of, because you say those alternate state, and I have a teacher, Loa Day, who would teach intuition. And so, of course, we use the body and so on to pick information, I would say. But what I find interesting, and she's really practical into like the way she teaches, but what I find interesting is the way people sense or feel is, as you said, totally depending on their own experience. So it's a kind of daydreaming. It's not that, but I'm going to make it simple. And the symbolic, it's only the symbolic of your own, of what you've experienced up to now. And someone will pick it differently. So
personal associations always have to come first.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I can look at someone's dream and have ideas about, I can look in all my symbols dictionaries, right? But ultimately, what really matters is that person's personal association with a symbol or an image that shows up for them.
Absolutely.
Right. And that sort of has us circle back to the power dynamics in healing professions. If we aren't coming into our work with people with a bit of a beginner's mind, of we don't actually know them, we're just always in a state of getting to know somebody, then I think we can hold a more expansive space for people to come to their own wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Jane, it was a pleasure to have you today. It's been quick.
Yeah. I know I did. That went by really fast. I feel like we could talk a lot more. I'm so curious of all the things you've mentioned that you're exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we finish, I have a small gift for you. I don't know if it's a gift. I will see.
Well, that's okay. Thank you.
I was talking to someone yesterday, and I asked her to share some words to you. So if you have a few seconds.
Oh my goodness gracious.
I'm going to share my screen and see if we can get there. Okay.
Hi, Jane. Stephanie asked me to come on this show and just say hello. And I wanted to say how lovely I found the little bit of your work that I've seen. And just to say how wonderful it is to hear people on the same page out there. Because as someone who has studied fascia for many years in the dissection lab and worked with people in manual and movement therapy, I have found the most profound resource of all was studying archetypal patterns with Dr. Caroline Myss and appreciating, as I know you do, the Jungian archetypes, because it brings us to patterning. And biotensegrity, or living tensegrity, or fasciotegrity, as my colleague John Sharkey and I call it, is how the patterning of the human body animates the form and how the form affects the patterning. So I loved hearing what you said in an interview about how appropriate stress actually brings us to adaptability and resilience, which is, I know that's what you train your clients in. It's absolutely wonderful. And it's a fabulous resource for assessment and adjustment in movement sessions when the somatic archetypal patterns are identified, because they're, to an extent, they're impersonal. So instead of us working from that intellectual center, I know we're singing from the same hymn sheet here, that we're under this spell of biomechanical reductionist reasoning that we must move this way because we do this and this is good for everybody. What we're then allowed to do is recognize the individual patterns that each person incorporates, and they can move towards their own optimization. And I'm sure, like you, I totally believe in the fact that the psyche that creates the psychosomatic patterns, the archetypal collective, that when we can match the psychosomatic patterning, and it's relatively accessible for people to do that. It takes a bit of study, and Caroline Myss always talks about archetypal archaeology, that we have to dig a bit to find our central, deeper theme. But by doing so, we actually honour the most appropriate movement sequences for ourselves. And as no doubt you create and facilitate, self-referencing becomes available, and we become so much more self-reliant, so much more embodied, so much more self-aware, and so much more able to contain the alchemy of our own transformation as everything changes in time. And I know you have some experience of tensegrity work, and that is just the essence of understanding the human fascial system, because being under tension, it makes us a human instrument. And just as every instrument in the orchestra has an archetypal sound, an archetypal scale, an archetypal octave, and a particular type of music, be it wind, percussion, string, as if they were archetypes, that's how we can then honour the human body in a much more realistic way. And I like to talk about bioemotional integrity. Bioemotional isn't a word, I made it up, but it just makes so much more sense of how we animate and authorize this form that is us, with all its mystery, with all its archetypal consciousness of the collective, with all its I and its team, and there's no I in team, and being part of it. Yeah, it's just a wonderful tapestry. And one of the reasons it's been so useful to me is because understanding fascia and teaching about the fascial architecture to movement and manual therapists, the keystone is that it's the foundation of our proprioceptive sense, our sense of ourselves in motion, in space, in time, in awareness, if we go in. Would. And that proprioceptive sense that it is the author of course, is the same root as appropriate. And for me, the theme that you're running just allows people to manage the emergent properties, whatever their age and stage of fitness, to improve their performance and remove pain. And I just love seeing it out in the world in as many corners as possible. So thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for the little that I've seen. And thank you, because I know it takes bon courage. I wish you so well.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. Beautiful, beautifully said. Thank you. Thank you for the gift.
Yeah, so it's Joanne Avison. I don't know if you know her. She
I will get to know her work.
Yeah, she did a book on yoga, fascia, anatomy, and movement. So she's really, as you can see, she's really into it.
Love it. I love it.
Really love. So last minute, 30 seconds, Jane, if you had a wish, what would that be?
That people would gravitate more to complexity versus reductionism.
Great.
Yeah.
That's
and cut back on social media use and read more books.
Good.
Yeah. So good to see you, Stephanie.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Jane, for your time.
Okay, bye.
Bye. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Jane Clapp. To know more about her, you can find her on her website, janeclapp.com. And you can also learn a bit more about Joanne Avison in episode 8 and Paul Linden in episode 7 of Unknowingly Connected. In the meantime, enjoy, and don't forget, it's all connected and we might not even know it. See you soon.